I want to let everybody know that today's webinar will be recorded. We're doing this in order to make sure it's available to those afterwards who are unavailable to take part today, or if you want to rewatch anything or share with people, you're welcome to do so. So we'll be making that recording available. As well, I want to let everybody know that should you need live captioning, if that would be of some assistance to you, you can look at the top of your screen and there's a live button. Click on Otter AI, and that'll provide a live transcription of what we're saying, if that is of any assistance to you. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Alex Frogalsky. I am a program consultant with Sask Arts based out of our Saskatoon office in Treaty 6 territory. I am very pleased that we've been able to launch the Sask Shift program this fall. That is its intention over the course of the year that's happening is to provide support through the Arts Action Research program that allows organizations to have access to a toolbox that will hopefully give them the means to overcome challenges that they're facing and to kind of navigate this new age that we're in with tools that will serve them in many different ways. We've had one of these webinars already earlier in the fall, and now this one we'll be having a few more of them in the new year. So please stay tuned. However you found out about today's event, we'll be using the same channels through our email and our social media to promote the upcoming webinars in the new year. I know it's quite lovely here in Saskatoon today, 7 degrees, so appreciate everybody sitting inside and not basking in the warmth while it lasts. Not long, I'm sure. So thanks for making time for this afternoon. I'm joined today, I think I have some program consultants here. Noreen New is also joining us. We have our administrative coordinator, Carmel Pretzlaw. If you have any technical difficulties, we can help you address them. Feel free to use the chat. We'll be monitoring that. During the presentation, I'm going to be going off screen just because I'm not important, so you don't need to see my face. But it is my great pleasure, and the person who you do want to direct your attention to is Ann Dunning. She is the lead consultant working with us on this program, and we've had some great feedback so far on it. So welcome back, Ann, for today's webinar.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody, for joining this afternoon. Great to see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces out there on the Zoom board. You're appearing as many little boxes, which means we've got lots of folks joining us today, which is great, and really happy to have you here for this workshop, which is the second of the open access series of workshops as part of the Sask Shift program. Today's workshop is 2 hours. We will take a break in the middle just so that you can kind of plan. I will let you know about halfway through. We'll take a bit of a break then. Also, to let you know that in the later part of the workshop, we'll have a little bit of time for you to break out and talk with colleagues as part of the process. So there'll be a fair amount of me sharing some ideas and talking to you, and also a little bit of an opportunity for you to think about those ideas and reflect on them with your colleagues who are here today. Because of the time constraint and because of the number of folks, I'm not going to have you all introduce yourselves, but feel free to use the Zoom feature to include your name and the organization that you're with in your Zoom profile there, so everyone can see who's here and who's part of it. If you want to stay on screen while I'm speaking, I'm always happy to see your faces, and it makes me feel a little bit more like I'm talking to people. But if you need to go off screen at any time, of course, please manage your cameras to whatever you need to be doing in the moment. As we go into breakout rooms, it's helpful if you do stay on screen for those conversations so that your colleagues can see you and know that you're with them. Any questions about logistics? I'm looking to see if I see any hands up. Carmen.
Yeah, I just want to confirm, Carmel told me that it was being recorded, which I saw when I entered the room, but is it being recorded for us to use later amongst people who weren't able to attend today?
Yes, you may, if you have folks who aren't able to join you today and you want to share this, you will have access to the recording to share with them.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Great. So with that, I'm going to get started on the topic for today, which is adopting an emergent mindset. And the reason that we wanted to do this particular workshop is that we're in a time when I think the idea of working in a different way, in a way that encourages new ideas and new ways of thinking, is particularly important for a lot of our organizations that are navigating a very volatile environment with a lot of change and a lot of unknowns. And so I wanted to take some time today to share with you some things that I think might be helpful tools for you and your organizations as you think about the world that you are working in and the way that things will change in the coming weeks, months, and years for your work. In the last workshop that I did on the sort of context for the sector and some of the conceptual basis of the work that we do at Arts Action Research, those of you who participated will remember that I talked quite a bit about the volatility of our sector and the world in which we work. And the fact that that requires us as organizations to undertake a way of working that is dynamic, that changes and adapts, and that taps into opportunities for bringing forward new ideas, or that undertakes this emergent mindset. And so today, in sort of follow-up to that initial conversation, I wanted to talk with you more specifically about that emergent mindset, what it is and how it can contribute to your organizations and your work, and also to share with you some of the tools and practices that we've seen in successful nonprofit arts organizations who adopt an emergent mindset. What are some of the ways that you can actually practice this and put this into the work that you're doing? And so I really want to focus our attention today on giving you some tools and letting you think about approaches that will help move you into this emergent mindset space. I'm going to start a slideshow here, so your screen will adjust. And just bring this slideshow. There we go. So you should be seeing the first of the deck of slides here. I'm going to use this slide deck just to kind of focus our attention and give you sort of the key concepts as we move through. The material in this deck I will make available after the presentation. So should you want these notes, you will be able to access those as well through Sask Arts. So anything that you see here, if you don't capture it, it will be available to you. So let's start. So the first thing I want to talk about here is this idea of responding to crisis and huge unknowns, because I think this is very related to the need for an emergent mindset. And I think that where we are right now, in terms of what's happening in our world, very much epitomizes this state of crisis and huge unknowns. We're in a time when there are both very real challenges that we're facing in terms of societal health issues, in terms of jobs, in terms of financial access and availability, and where there are also huge unknowns. We cannot predict where this whole thing is moving in the long term. None of us, not arts professionals, not anyone, can really understand where this is moving. And so we're working in this space that puts us in a space of dealing with crisis and huge unknowns. Now, this state of crisis and huge unknowns can be, as it is now, a sort of society-wide issue, but sometimes we're dealing with those issues on a more individual organizational basis. And these tools that I'm going to talk about today are applicable no matter whether the state of crisis and huge unknowns that you're responding to are as a result of societal issues and bigger external issues, or whether they're related to a crisis internally and a state of unknowing as a result of where you are as an organization internally. And in terms of responding to this kind of state, to being in this kind of an environment, there are basically two stages of work that an organization has to go through to really respond effectively. The first stage of responding to crisis is surviving and sustaining. So when a crisis hits, when we're in a state of unknowing and volatility, and our expectations and our support networks are jeopardized or shifted, the very first thing we need to do in terms of leading and moving forward is to figure out how to survive and sustain our organizations and our work through this period of challenge. The second stage of work is to revive and to reconceptualize. As things rebalance, as we manage to rebuild our sustainability and know that we're able to move forward, we then have to move into a space of revival, of renewal, of reconceptualizing where we're going from there, and looking at how the world has changed and how we will change in order to respond to the changes in the world around us. The first phase of this, in terms of where we are in the world right now, is the work that you have all been doing over the past 18 months, the survival and sustaining of your organizations, particularly in a world in which many of us are involved in live gathering, bringing people together, either for performance or learning or community building. And all of that normal activity for us has been cut off for a period of time. And so in addressing that, the first thing that all of you have had to do, and that most of you, I'm going to argue, have done quite successfully, is to immediately figure out how to survive and sustain your mission, your organization, your vision through this period. And there really are four key elements that we see in terms of surviving and sustaining organizations. The first is to stabilize and minimize any damages. So looking at how do we, given the crisis that we're in, how do we stabilize our organization? How do we move ourselves out of a state of constant crisis and minimize any damage that's happening for our organization? And this again applies whether the challenge, the crisis is coming from outside or from inside the organization. So for example, if we had an internal crisis that had to do with a toxic person within our organization that's causing damage to our team, to our reputation, this first phase would require us to minimize damage by removing that toxic influence from our environment. And so absolutely the first phase of survival is getting to this place of stabilizing and minimizing damage. The second thing that we need to do in order to survive and sustain is to identify our priorities, really take stock of what's important to us, our friends and our assets, really understand who's with us and what resources do we have even in the diminished circumstances we might be in. It is really critical that we don't lose sight in the middle of a crisis of the people, the resources, and the things that matter to us. And I noticed, for organizations in this particular crisis of the pandemic, we saw lots of organizations early on who really lost sight of the importance of, for example, their staff teams, thinking about should we lay everybody off immediately, rather than thinking about how can we sustain those relationships, which are pivotal and important to our organizations and to moving forward. And so thinking about what's important to you is absolutely critical to effective surviving and sustaining your organization. And when we work with organizations in crisis, we recommend that they create and cast a crisis intervention team, a group of people who are really going to help us to keep our focus on those things that are important, on those resources that we have, on the network of friends and supporters around us, so that we don't get into a state of despair or sort of loss that doesn't allow us to keep our organizations afloat. Next, we need to move into a mindset and a frame of working that allows us to make short, medium, and long-term action plans. And by short action plans, your short action plan may be, what are we going to do in the next 2 weeks to get through, this particular phase of the crisis? Then once we get through the next 2 weeks, what's our 2-month plan? And then what are our longer range plans that we're moving towards? And so continually adapting and developing very short, medium, and long-term action plans. Activating your planning during this phase is absolutely essential for your organization. Many organizations feel like, oh, when things are not, optimal, maybe I should just hunker down and not plan for the future. And yet you're much more sustainable when you're thinking about how you're going to navigate the immediate period, the midterm period, and the longer term period. So making action planning a part of your work will keep you focused and will ensure that you really can continue to move forward in spite of the challenges around you. And then finally, in terms of survival and sustaining your organization, is identifying and adopting your organization's irreducible minimum format. And this irreducible minimum format really is the most sort of condensed, most minimal outlay of resources that you as an organization can maintain in order to keep yourself a going concern and without tapping out your resources. So it is a sweet spot between cutting back so much that you actually lose viability as an organization and not cutting back enough that you start to run down your resource base. And you have to work again with your crisis intervention team to look at what assets you have and to determine what is that appropriate balance that puts us in an irreducible minimum operating format, so that we're not running down resources, but that we're investing enough to keep our organization viable and able to move forward. Once you have survived and you get to a place where you are able to sort of continue and move forward, and as you look to the future, you need to then think about and start to frame your work towards this idea of reviving and reconceptualizing. So we may be working at this irreducible baseline operation for a period of time, but as things stabilize, we're going to want to look to the future and start to revive, regenerate, and reconceptualize our organizations moving forward. And there are two really important steps in making that work happen. The first of which is to restore for your organization the dynamic balance that I talked about in the earlier workshop, this set of complex adaptive behaviors, small adjustments that keep you in a constant state of moving balance as an organization. We need to get to a place where we're moving from irreducible minimum operations into a place where we're restoring our operations into a state of dynamic balance. Not that we're reaching a particular level of operations, not that we're going back to a prior set level of operations, but that we're restoring our organization to a place where we're in a state of dynamic balance around whatever balance point we may have the resources to sustain. And the other thing we need to do if we're going to revive and reconceptualize our organizations, if we're going to emerge into a new world and create a new normal for our organizations, is we need to adopt an emergent mindset. We need to put ourselves in a place where we are prepared for, where we're supporting, and where we're engaging in the activities that allow new approaches, new ways of working, to emerge within our organizations and for our people, so that we can then move forward with a really new way of working. That's not going to be the old normal. It's not going to be a return to the way things were, but it's going to allow us to look at the circumstances around us and to create something new that will sustain and build us for the future. So what is an emergent mindset? I keep talking about this sort of emergent mindset, and it's sort of the fundamental piece of the work that I'm sharing with you today. Well, an emergent mindset really comes from this idea of emergence. And emergence is much coming from little, where the whole is much more complex than the sum of the parts. Emergence really is where, we're able to bring resources together, and in doing that, in bringing those resources together, the outcome of that is something that is much greater, much more complex than what we would anticipate from each of those elements separately. So an emergent idea is something that is entirely new and somewhat unexpected, coming out of the pieces that are put together, the resources that are brought together in order to generate a new way of working and thinking. And emergence is actually, an emergent process is actually an artistic process, for example. So when we create a new work of art, be it a dance performance, be it a book, be it a painting, what's happening there is emergence. We're taking raw materials, we're taking ideas, and in bringing them together through the artistic process, something new and more complex than the elements that were put together emerges from that. And so emergence is something we're very familiar with in our work in the arts sector. We deal with emergence quite continually in terms of the work that's generated by our sector, by our artists, and by the creative people who work within this environment. An emergent mindset is a way of thinking that combines insight and foresight to learn, adapt, iterate, and bring about change. So the mindset, this sort of emergent mindset, is an approach, a way of thinking about things that uses insight, which by definition is the capacity to gain an accurate and deep intuitive understanding of a person or thing. So insight is really tapping into our intuition, to our depth of knowledge, to our understanding of the things around us. And foresight, which is the ability to predict which is the ability to predict what will happen or be needed in the future, which really is our ability to sort of take the things that we know, and given the things that we know, start to understand how the future might unfold for us. It's the sort of predictive. So we've got the intuitive and the predictive, and using those resources through an emergent mindset, we can learn, adapt, iterate, so change and update, and bring about change for our organizations. So it's a powerful way of using the resources that we have and the knowledge bases that we have to bring about change for our organizations. Given that there is this sort of powerful tool, this emergent mindset that we might be able to adopt to move our organizations forward, the next thing I really want to sort of think about and share with you is this idea of, okay, so when do we want to be using this emergent mindset? When do we want to get into a space where we're in this state of emergence and bringing forward new, original, complex ideas? Well, there are three circumstances that I know for sure from organizations that I've worked with when this mindset is particularly useful for organizations. The first is when new opportunities are present. So when we're in a state where there are new opportunities for our organization in the environment or internally, adopting an emergent mindset is one of the ways that we can best use those opportunities to generate change and positive outcomes for our organization. So taking advantage of new opportunities is one place in which emergence is a really helpful resource. The second time when an emergent mindset is useful is when existing solutions are no longer working. So we've been doing something, and in the past, it has worked for us, it has sustained us, it has supported us, but because of shifts in our environment or our organization, suddenly we find that those existing solutions, those existing ways of working are no longer working for us. They're no longer having the effective outcomes for our organization. And when that happens, we need to imagine new ways of working. We need to move out of our existing structures and create new structures. And so an emergent mindset is very helpful in those moments to allow us to really create the new way of working that's going to help to sustain and move our organizations forward. And then finally, an emergent mindset is very useful in establishing a new normal. So when we've come through a period of disruptive change, when we've had a lot of adaptation within our environment, we emerge from that looking to restore a sense of normalcy, but recognizing that this normal state that we're moving into is not the normal we are familiar with, but a new normal that we need to define. And an emergent mindset can help us to look at the environment around us, to use our intuitive skills and capacity and our predictive skills and capacity to help us to create and establish a new normal for our organization. And this is the space that I think a lot of us are starting to move into as we think about what are our new normals going to look like as we try to navigate this next period of living with the remains of the pandemic and the future environment in which we're going to be working. Now, an emergent mindset is a complex set of things. And in my last workshop, I talked about this, the elements of an emergent mindset. What makes an emergent mindset? What are the components of an emergent mindset that we see and observe? And these are a number of things that we have observed in terms of the organizations that exhibit this sort of emergent approach to their work. They're organizations that reaffirm and hold constant their core values and vision. They're organizations that are clear about what they stand for and what they're trying to achieve. And that's important because as new ideas emerge, you want to continually focus that effort and that work in such a way that it supports and reaffirms those ideas of the core values and vision, rather than moves your organization off center and in new directions that might drive you away from the values that define your work. Second, these organizations that have an emergent mindset adopt a learning ethos. They're organizations in which there is an openness to new ideas, in which there is a value placed on learning at all levels of the organization, of ensuring that people are constantly able to continue to adapt, to build their skill sets, and to bring on board new ideas for the organization. They're organizations that both find opportunities and act on those opportunities. So they're organizations that have their eyes open to what opportunities are out in the world and who are willing to act on the opportunities that they find. And there are organizations that create opportunities that are not available. So organizations that envision a world in which there are opportunities and use their resources to create those opportunities when they don't find them in the world around them. So they're very focused on the opportunities that they know are there and also on the opportunities that they want to be there. And they use their resources to act on and develop those opportunities over time. They're organizations that use time as a resource. And what I mean by this is, oftentimes, time in kind of our urgent society becomes not a resource, but a burden to us. We run out of time. We're constantly up against time in our organizations. And those organizations that have adopted an emergent mindset are able to really understand time and use it more effectively for them, for themselves, thinking about how do we extend our work over time in a way that allows it to unfold in more effective ways? How do we not try to do everything at once, but use time and spreading things out over time as a way to really maximize the resources that we have? And how do we create time as a resource by engaging more folks and their time and their efforts in the work that we're doing? And so they have a different relationship to time, in which time isn't driving them, but they are organizing and using time effectively. These organizations that have an emergent mindset are building and utilizing networks. Most of our organizations have relatively little access to financial resources, but find that they can vastly increase the resources available to them by building relationships, partnerships, and networks. And I see so many organizations in our sector who have become very good at building these relationships and looking for connections within their networks that can help to support creating the opportunities that are not available, and helping them to learn and develop as organizations. And so thinking about networks, thinking about relationships as a resource is a very big part of an emergent mindset. That's where many of the opportunities exist or can be created for organizations that have fewer financial resources. Organizations with an emergent mindset incorporate whole systems thinking. And what I mean by this is, we have a tendency to become a very sort of reductionist in our thinking, to focus on a particular element or a particular process or a particular piece of the structure, rather than looking at the whole system, the whole process, the whole structure. And by returning to a sort of sense of whole systems thinking, in which not only is your organization a whole system, but your organization is part of a bigger ecosystem of community, of other arts organization and artists and support organizations. By thinking of whole systems, we can identify resources that don't appear to be available when we look only at an isolated component of the system. And so this whole systems thinking, this different perspective, is really vital to having an emergent mindset. And then the final piece of these organizations with an emergent mindset, the final element that we see, is that they proactively reference internal needs to external realities. So they're organizations that think first about, what do we need and want to achieve, and how do we adapt external realities to support that? How do we arrange external realities that we're facing around our internal needs, as opposed to organizations that look at the external challenges and define their internal expectations and plans by the sort of confines of the external realities that they find. So these are organizations that really look to vision and intention and build external realities, adapt external realities to those internal intentions, as opposed to creating internal intentions that simply align with the external realities that they find around them. So that's the sort of context of emergent mindset. That's why we want an emergent mindset. That's what an emergent mindset looks like. And that's really the sort of framework for what I want to share with you in the rest of our conversation today, which is the practice of building emergent mindsets within your organization. Before I go on to this sort of practical application here, does anyone have any questions about what I've shared about an emergent mindset, about organizations that exhibit this mindset? Anything that I can clarify before I move forward? I'm scanning here for hands up. Alex can help me if he sees any that I don't, but. All right, I don't see any questions right now. So I'm going to move forward into practice then and think about now all of you, let's assume, having heard me talk about this and my experience with organizations that have emergent mindset, let's assume you want to adopt this emergent mindset. It sounds like exactly the kind of thing you need as an organization to move forward. How do you go about doing that? How do you start to build those things into your organization? Well, I have 8 practices that I want to share with you today that are practices that I have seen in arts organizations that I've worked with, that they're using that encourage emergent mindsets within their organization. And so I'm going to walk through these and tell you a little bit about these tools and how you might use them in your organization. So the first of these practices is using visual and non-linear tools. So often when we think about problems or challenges, we adopt the practice of writing out a list of things we want to deal with, or a block of text about our problem that we're trying to address. We put things into sort of very linear, sort of logical flowcharts or forms or networks. And what we have found and what we have seen is that many of the organizations in which emergent ideas come forward, in which the new idea is generated, are organizations that move out of this kind of linear way of thinking or sort of textual base of thinking and into using tools that allow them to visualize information and to organize information in non-linear ways. So for example, some organizations are using things like mind maps, somewhat like what you're seeing on your screen now, where we've got different ideas. They're organized, sort of somewhat haphazardly on a page, but we can draw links and connections between them. Oftentimes with organizations, when they're trying to explore, for example, a new program or activity, rather than listing the different potential elements or audiences for that program, they'll start to create a map or a visual that allows them to put these pieces of information together, but not to organize them in a linear way that creates some sort of expected flow through that information. It disrupts sort of a sense of traditional or expected flow. Other organizations use tools like drawings or visualizations, trying to, for example, envision the future they're trying to create, describing that, telling the story of that future, using those visualizations, using those drawings to start to bring forward things that they may not yet be able to talk about in words, but that they can demonstrate, that they can show visually or express through a sort of vision of what that looks or feels like to them. We also, see some organizations who use tools like vision boards. Individuals use these sometimes, when they're trying to achieve a goal in life. You start to gather images that represent your goal. You put those in front of you so that you sort of have a constant reminder of your goal, so that it shares with you the future that you're trying to create. There are organizations that use these tools as well, putting together images, putting those in a place where they can see them and be reminded about them, and where those things will sort of influence their thinking about the organization and how they're moving forward. And so we see these organizations that really bring emergent ideas forward being very visually driven in that sort of collection of images. I have one theater group that I work with in New York who has a very interesting non-linear tool to think about their productions and the work that they create that I want to share with you. The organization is a group called the Debate Society. They're a devised theater group. They create new theater pieces. And one of the they have three principal artists that work within the organization that generate the work. They often bring together other collaborators with them. And one of the tools that they use in their artistic practice to help them to move beyond a kind of imposed structure too early in the process of developing work is a tool that they call what it is, what it isn't. And what they do is they sit down together at the beginning of the process with all of their collaborators around, and they think about the project that they're trying to undertake. And they list off and share with each other things that feel like what it is that they're trying to do, and things that feel like what it isn't that they're trying to do. So for example, they might sit down and think about a project that they're trying to undertake, and they might come up with a list of things that it is that include snow days and running into an old friend and eating lasagna. Things that evoke for them a certain mood, a certain way of thinking, a certain representation that are not literal. They're not literally going to do a play about snow days, but snow days for them might represent a certain sense of wonder and a certain sense of freedom and a certain sense of the unexpected that they're trying to capture in thinking about this project. And so they generate these lists that are really much more sort of metaphorical or emotional based images for them about the project and the shape that it's going to take, and the things that represent what they don't want the project to move towards. And those lists become a sort of guiding force as they move through the process. It allows them to move away from having to have too much of a prescribed structure for their work, and to create an environment for their work that feels meaningful for them and how they move it forward. So these are some of the visual and non-linear tools that I know that folks are using as they sort of try to bring together ideas, but move out of having an overly structured sort of format of ideas that prevents new ideas from emerging and new concepts from coming out of that. So that's the first of the tools that I want to share with you. The second is somewhat related to that, and that is connect the dots and look for the patterns. One of the things that organizations that are good emergent thinkers do is that they take the information that they have and they make connections between things that we might not otherwise see. They're good at understanding the connections, the patterns that exist between things, and often the things that are not obvious on the surface. When an organization wants to develop an emergent mindset, if we start to organize our information in non-linear ways, it often helps us to move in spaces where we can now make connections between things that in a list form wouldn't be obvious, wouldn't jump out at us. But by putting it into a visual format, by putting it into a non-linear format, by breaking out the expectation of how things connect, we can start to sometimes see connections between different ideas, different resources, different networks or people that we wouldn't otherwise see. And so we need to make a practice both of putting our information in formats that allow us to see new connections and spending the time with our information to make those connections, to identify where this idea or piece of work over here might actually be related to this idea or a piece of work over here, and make the connection point between those things. This also speaks to what I talked about earlier in terms of whole systems thinking. If we can really look at the whole system here, we can see how something involved in the fundraising aspect of our work may connect deeply to something involved in the programming aspect of our work. And so breaking down the silos and structures that keep that information separate and looking for where those pieces connect can often develop emergent new ideas for how an organization works and operates. One example I have of this is a project that the Toronto Dance Theatre in Toronto undertook a number of years ago, in which they were thinking about how they could create a greater sense of connection and engagement and involvement between their core patrons and the work that they were doing in the company in creating and presenting dance works. And they started to break down this sort of barrier between patron and artist, and they came up with a program which invited supporters to participate over a series of 6 dance workshops to learn choreography, create their own choreographic sequences, and be part of a performance for their family and friends at the end of the process. It was an experiment when they first started out. It became a hugely popular program in that the donors, the supporters got to actually spend time in the studio with the artists. They were not all brilliant dancers at the end of the day, but they had a much deeper understanding of what it took to do the work and engage with the work. And they felt much more a part of the network and the family of that organization. So they connected the dots between a donor, a supporter of the organization over here, and the work that happened in the studio of creating and presenting work. They put those dots together and they created something that was much bigger than the sum of those parts, that really generated both a resource in terms of increased funding for their organization, but also goodwill and support from that important network of folks around them. Another thing I think, as we think about connecting the dots here, is something that I think we're all actually much better at in this sector than we give ourselves credit for, which is storytelling. Because storytelling is essentially one of the ways that we connect the dots of information that we have. It's one of the ways that we structure and bring together ideas. And I think that, you know, oftentimes when we are trying to express information or we're trying to think about process for our organization, we think about it in a sort of more mechanistic sense, and we express it in a way that is more factual in terms of how we share the information, rather than embracing it as an opportunity to tell a story, to connect the pieces of what we're doing in a narrative. And so one piece of connecting the dots is, how do we take these different things that we're trying to reconcile, that we're trying to achieve, that we're trying to address in our organization, and how do we bring them together in a narrative of what's happening here that we can engage people around. And so I think in terms of connecting the dots and looking for patterns, one of the things that I would encourage you to do in that process is to think about, what is the story of this project, of this challenge, of this initiative? How would we tell the story of this, which will allow you to bring information together in different ways? One of the things that I've always noticed when I've been asked, for example, to review grant applications, is how much the applications that tell a story are so much more compelling and engaging than the applications that simply convey factual information. And so thinking about bringing our information together, connecting the dots in a narrative, is a very powerful way for us to reorganize information and also to convey information as an organization. The final thing I want to say on connecting the dots, and particularly on looking for patterns, is, you know, there's this concept, this structure in nature called fractals. I think all of you probably seen or heard about fractals. If you don't know fractals, go on the internet and look up fractals. You'll get amazing images of, often in nature, of these structures. And the thing that is amazing about fractals and the structures of fractals is essentially they are components of nested pattern. So the pattern on one level is repeated on the next level, is repeated on the next level. And what we have are sort of these amazingly complex images that are a composite of a series of repeated, simpler patterns within them. And the reason that I'm raising this for you is that I think oftentimes we have within our organization successful processes, activities, ways of working that we see in isolation. And I think that one of the things that we can do when we're looking for patterns is look for those patterns within our organization that work well, and think about how can we replicate this pattern in another activity that we do in another area where we're struggling. How can we take what we know here and adapt that and use that on a different scale or in a different way within the organization? And in the work that we do with arts organizations, one of the things that we most encourage arts organizations to do is to be really cognizant of the artistic process that drives the work of the artists within your organizations, within your communities, and how that as a process, as a pattern of activity, can be so effectively applied to many of the other things that we do. Thinking about how the process of, bringing together elements to create new outcomes can be used not only in the studio or the theater or the creative spaces where we work, but also in the offices and in the community centers and the classrooms in which we work. So really thinking about patterns and the repetition of patterns and the duplication of patterns throughout our organization is another important component of building this emergent mindset. The next practice that I want to share with you and have you think about in terms of creating an emergent mindset for yourself is the importance of getting new perspectives and of embracing diversity. Most of the challenges, most of the opportunities that we're trying to seize, most of the work that we do does not have a single right answer. We're not, working in a space where there's one thing that's going to work and everything else will not work. For almost everything that you are going to be trying to navigate as an organization, there are multiple different successful ways to address that. There are also multiple different unsuccessful ways to address that. But what I'm trying to convey to you is that if we only come at our challenges from one perspective, if we try to seek out the singular answer, we actually miss out on the spectrum of possible other answers, the spectrum of possible other approaches, and possibly other answers and approaches that are better than the one that we might see from our perspective. And so the organizations that I see that are most successful in nurturing these emergent ideas and practices and concepts are the organizations that really embrace multiple different perspectives, that encourage everyone within their organization to come forward with ideas, that recognize that the best ideas do not come from the top, that there are the greatest idea, the most effective idea can come from anywhere. And if we aren't opening spaces for those ideas to come forward, then we're missing out on some of the most important opportunities that we can have as organizations. If we all have the same life experience within our organization, if we all come from the same background and the same culture and the same context, then we will not see beyond a certain worldview, and that is limiting for us. And so one of the things I think that is most encouraging is, particularly as our sector reckons with the reality that we have not built diversity in our sector in a meaningful way to date, is that as we start to recognize the value of those things, it is going to create for us a much richer palette of ideas and information and approaches than we've been working with to date. As we bring in new perspectives and more diverse voices, it is going to absolutely enrich and strengthen our sector. And that's an exciting possibility and exciting moment for our sector and for our organizations if we can really embrace these new perspectives and the diversity of different experiences and realities. The fourth thing that is very helpful for organizations who are looking to generate emergent ideas is to reframe the question. One of the things that we often don't think about is how the questions that we ask determine the answers that we get. You know, we frame our thinking around the question and how it's posed to us, and therefore the answer that we give is really aligned with the intentions of the question. And I think that we don't often enough ask ourselves, are we asking the right thing? We don't spend as much time asking the question as answering the question. We want to get the question down, we want to have the question in front of us, and then we want to spend most of our time generating the multiple potential answers to the question. And I would say that we would be more effective in emerging new ideas and different approaches if we spent more time on the questions that we ask and less time on generating multiple different answers to a singular question. So, for example, we might start from a place where we ask the question, how do we get more audience members in the theater? And if that's the question that we ask, there are a certain range of answers that are going to come forward in thinking about the solution to that particular problem of getting more audience members in the theater. But if we stopped before we go to answering the question and said, is that the question? We could then start to think about, well, maybe the question isn't how do we get more audience members in the theater, but maybe the question is, what do potential audience members want to experience? Maybe we need to think of this not from our perspective of how do we get them in the space that we want them in, and we started thinking about it from the audience perspective. What is the experience or relationship they want? That maybe is the question. Or we could also think about this question from the perspective of why are we trying to get more audiences in the theater? And then the question might be, how can we build a sustainable income to support our work? And if that's the question, then we need to reframe our answer away from simply being about audience building and into a bigger context of the sort of sustainable base of support and what components there are to that. And then finally, we might even come from the place of how do we get more audience members in the theater and what's behind that question. And we might come to the question of how do we connect with our community? Maybe it's not about them being in our space. Maybe we're assuming them being in our space is about making connection with them. But by taking it out of the question of how do we get more audiences in the theater and reframing the question as how do we connect with our community, we open up new possibilities for what the answer to that might be. And it might be that the answer to that is not strictly confined to the space of our theater and having them in our space. The answer to that might be that part of connecting with our community is going out and being in their spaces and spending time with those community members. And so I think that reframing the question understanding what kind of response we're going to get from different questions is an important component of really thinking through the challenges that we're going through. And without that, we're going to very much narrow the possibilities of what comes forward and what solutions we're going to generate. So those are the first 4 of the 8 approaches that I'm sharing with you today. The first, just to recap what we talked about, the first was that we're going to use visual and nonlinear tools. The second is that we're going to connect the dots and look for patterns. The third is that we're going to get new perspectives and embrace diversity. And the fourth is that we're going to reframe the question. What I'm going to do now is give you a little break. You can absorb some of the things that we've talked about, and then we're going to come back and have a bit of a dialogue around these first 4 before I share with you the next 4 of these pieces. So we're at 2 o'clock your time now. We'll take 10 minutes and come back at 10 past. All right. I'll stay in the space if you have any questions as you're breaking here. Can just throw up a throw up a thumbs up or something so that I know you're back. There we go. Hi, Cindy. Great, thank you. Good to see you back in your spaces. Great, looks like we're all returning here. So I left you with a few things to think about in terms of these practices, this first set of practices, as it were, that I talked you through. And I'm going to bring up here. So you see on your screen here, these are the first 4 practices we've talked about, using visual and nonlinear tools, connecting the dots, looking for patterns, getting new perspectives, embracing diversity, and reframing the question. And so in thinking about this, what I want to do is give you an opportunity to talk with a few of your peers, to think about, with these 4 mindset practices, how are you using these tools right now to gain insights and welcome emergent ideas? If you are there tools here that you recognize, things that you are doing? If so, how are you doing them? Are there other tools that you're using in order to gain insights and develop new emergent ideas in your space that are similar to these? And how might you integrate these approaches in your work? What are ways that you might think to do these things on a regular basis in the work that you do? And so what I'd like to do is to put you into smaller breakout groups with your peers who are in the workshop today. And in each of your breakout groups, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes here to sort of think about these 4 things that we've talked about, to talk with your colleagues about how these tools are currently working for you, if you're using any of these tools, and to talk with colleagues about how you think you might integrate these approaches into your work in the future, if you're not using them now or not using them as much as you would like to be doing. So I think that all of you have probably been in spaces where we've done breakout rooms. I will assign the rooms and you will get a notice on your screen asking you to join the breakout. If you click on that, you will find yourself in a space with some colleagues. So I invite you then to introduce yourselves to each other and to have a short conversation about these emergent practices and how they might come into play in the work that you're doing. If you have any problems navigating this, you can reach out to either Alex or I, and we'll get you assigned. And I will give you a 1-minute warning to all of the rooms before we're going to close, and then the rooms will close abruptly in the middle of whatever you're saying at that time, and you'll be brought back into the main space. So look out for your invitations to join breakouts now. Apologize to whoever got cut off in mid-statement with the return from the breakout groups. I know it's very abrupt when it happens. So how were the conversations? Did anything come up that you want to share with the broader group in those conversations that you think might be helpful to everyone?
I will share one thing, Anne and everyone else, and that is, Jackie spoke about this a lot, but this is very helpful on many levels. They need more time to process than what can happen to go into a breakout room because there's so much going on. However, what's really clear, not in this workshop only for myself, is that the language that you're bringing forward with these well thought out examples of things is really useful for language to use not only within our organization as a staff and as the artists, but to translate information through to the board of directors, and also for myself, I feel like, to the funders, to be able to have actual languaging that, and in this case, maybe there'll be some continuity, obviously, through the funding agencies and also through our own community, to be able to lean towards, to understand what we're talking about. Most of the things that we saw there, most of us in the breakout room, had been familiar with and or utilizing in some way or another, but the languaging wasn't there. So I'm really appreciative of that.
Thank you. That's good to know that it's helpful to have that kind of language context to talk about it. Any other sharing from the breakouts?
Yeah, sure. And it's Darcy McLean. So Heather and John were in my breakout, and I gave the perspective of what I'm doing in my work with Sask Interactive, nonprofit, etc. And I really appreciated your comment this morning about greater connection and engagement, which I have a brand new board as of our AGM, and so the engagement is really quite it's raw right now, and we're just trying to build up the cohesiveness, etc. And so that kind of comes back to your point of stabilize and minimize. And Heather shared a comment around her new role and her capacity and learning and not absorbing the other what she's inherited, but also paving a new road. I made another comment around diversity. On my board, I just lost my diversity. I lost my BIPOC. I lost my one and only female, and now we're a board of 10 white men. So that's a little hard for the community maybe to understand, but and or realize what happened. So part of that was an interesting aspect that John and Heather and I shared.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Any other thoughts or ideas that came up in the breakouts that you want to share here? Carmen?
I think one thing that we talked about was how, these practices, if you actually put them into play, will be transformative to the organization. Reframing the question is a really good example of it. And I love that example of what it is, what it isn't. Mm-hmm. I think that can really help you get right to the heart of the matter really quickly. And I'm going to start using it here immediately because I think it will be very useful. So anyway, I look forward to the next 4. I was just commenting, though, as a visual arts organization, we don't do visual and nonlinear tools. And it's primarily because our building doesn't have a speck of an inch of room, and visual tools actually take a lot of space. And we, so I have to think about that one.
Yeah,
and how we do it.
That is a challenge.
Yeah.
It changes your spatial use. So that's definitely a challenge. One thing I just want to bring forward, if I can, is that I popped into one of the sessions and Cynthia from On the Boards was mentioning, one of the things that she got her thinking about was, I'm asking you to move away from the lists and to really go into this nonlinear thinking, which, generates the ideas, but then you have to put it into the lists in order to communicate it to others, or in order to, execute the sort of operational plan. And so you don't really get entirely away from lists. They're still lists, but we've added this moment where we move away from the structure of lists and allow ourselves to generate new ideas. So an important observation that we're not going to be getting rid of lists entirely, but we're going to see them as having a different role in terms of moving forward. Heather, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer, I mentioned this in my group in my final 10 seconds before we came back here, that one of the things that we're doing here at Persephone, Kristen and I, we talk a lot, and traditionally in the model that we exist in, decision-making power would rest with us, either together or separately. And so really opening up that process of who actually gets a say in all of those decision-making moments does bring that emergent mindset in for us, because we can and do invite people that are in variety of different roles in the community, different relationships with the organization, that come from different communities, different backgrounds, and have different levels of experience within our industry. And that does keep us with fresh perspective all the time, instead of, being in a comfortable place all the time where we feel confident in our choices.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think two things that strike me about that is, yes, the moving out of the sort of comfort space of, the easy relationship that with each other, but also the time that it takes to involve other folks. And, so sometimes in some places we can't do that because of, the need to move things rapidly. But when we can make the time, it is a great opportunity to bring in those other perspectives and new ideas. Thank you. Any final comments before we move to the second set of 4 practices? All right, so let me share my screen again here so I can walk you through the next set. So there's our first set. So the first of the second series that I want to share with you is the practice of iterating and adapting. And I've chosen to include this quote here, which is one of my all-time favorites from Samuel Beckett: "Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better." And this really is, the mantra of the sort of iterative design thinking, the sort of iterative approach to work, which is that for us to really be able to achieve the big things, what we have to get good at is trying the small things, being okay with failing, but learning from failure, adapting and trying again. And the thing about taking this kind of approach to design, to thinking, to building ideas, is that absolutely involved in this is a certain level of risk. And without risk, it actually, if we know that every single thing that we try is predetermined to succeed, then we're missing out on the things that could generate real innovative new ways of thinking. And so we have to accept a certain amount of risk to really take on an iterative and adaptive mindset. We have to try new things that we don't know the outcomes of. And we have to take a chance on some of those things in order to be able to discover the amazing opportunity, the amazing new approach or way of working. And so iteration and adaptation in our organizations is a way of taking on risk, but it's also a way of doing that in which the stakes are not as high as if we go for the sort of grand gesture or massive leap. You know, sometimes we get into a mindset of thinking that when we're trying to change or reimagine or redevelop our organization, that we want to make the grand gesture, that we want to change everything and reveal ourselves as this whole new institution all in one step. And while that has a romantic notion to it, to, you know, sort of make the grand new entrance, what it does is it takes out the sort of buffer against massive risk. If we take small steps, we try them, we learn from them, we adapt, and we take the next small step, we're breaking down that big risk into a smaller series of risks that are more manageable for our organizations and our resources. And so if you think about change not as the grand gesture, but change as a sort of constant series of small steps in which you try new things, you look at the results of those things, you continue those things that work and build on those, and you adapt and change the things that don't work, it gives you a framework in which to take necessary and important risk without putting yourself in a position of perilous risk, of the grand gesture gone wrong. And so, you know, I think that emergent organizations are often the organizations that are not out there, you know, getting a lot of attention because they're not making the splashy big change, but they're organizations that quietly and constantly are changing, that are evolving internally, and that if you look at over time, have fundamentally shifted the way they work, the things that they produce, et cetera, but done it in a way that is under the radar often of the big grand gesture. And so I think this is an approach, and it's, you know, I think often because of resources, it's an approach that nonprofit arts groups have adopted, in that we don't often get someone who's going to take us, take on resourcing a big shift for us, but who may come with us on a small change, and who, when they see that small change succeed, will help move us to the next small change. And so I think thinking about how can we integrate and get better at this iteration and adaptation, how can we take on risk in ways that makes it a normal and important part of our work, but doesn't put us in a place where we're overextended and potentially in peril from the scale of risk that we're taking on. The next approach that I want to share with you is to anticipate. And I have a hockey player here because my favorite anticipation quote, and I'm showing my Canadian roots here, is the quote from Wayne Gretzky that says, it attributes his success to the fact that in his career, what he tried to do was to skate to where the puck was going to be. Rather than skating to where the puck already was, he was constantly trying to be ahead of the puck. And because of his skill at predicting and knowing where the puck was going and understanding the game, he of course became the most successful hockey player in history. And this tool, this ability to anticipate, is a key component for our organizations in allowing emergent thinking to come forward. if we can get into a space where we aren't simply focusing our energy on where we are now, but we are looking to the future, we are considering the next thing that's coming, and we are planning for and preparing for that, we will align our resources more effectively to be there in the moment that the new idea emerges, that the new opportunity comes forth, that we can advance and take advantage of. And so one of the things about anticipation and being ahead of the puck is that it requires you as a leader, as an organization, as a team, to trust yourselves. Because when we get further out from the known into the unknown, which by its nature the future is, we tend to get more fearful about the possibility of being wrong. What if we skate to where the puck is going to be and the puck goes in a different direction? What if we skate to where the puck is going to be and the game shuts down in the process? The pandemic cuts out the whole system. And I think our fear often holds us back from really getting out in front of things, really trying to be in position for what's next. Now, you are not 100% of the time going to perfectly match up being where the puck is going to be. Even Gretzky, who was exceptional, was not always in the right position on every play. But if you can trust yourself and get ahead of things, you are going to hit a percentage of the time and be there in advance. And those moments will allow you to really develop emergent ideas and new ways of working. And when you're not in the right place, if you have an iterative adaptive mindset, you will, in that moment, recognize that you were not successful in anticipating the next move, and you will adapt and change for your next step. And so it's not a monumental failure to be out ahead of the puck and not be entirely in the right place, but there may be new opportunities that emerge from the place that you end up. And so I think it's important that we develop and integrate this idea of anticipatory behavior, of thinking ahead and trying to be at the next spot, that we trust ourselves in doing that. And one of the interesting things that often happens when we get into that mindset is that by the very fact that we have chosen a direction and moved in a way, we actually end up shaping the future in a way. And so if we're anticipating a certain next step and we get there, oftentimes when we get there, we are able to align resources around us and make the place that we've come to work for us. And so by anticipating, by thinking ahead, by moving towards where the puck is going to be, we often actualize the puck getting there. We often shape the future that we're trying to create. And so I want to encourage you to be future thinkers, to be anticipatory, to trust your instincts, and to move forward such that you can shape the future that you're trying to create for your organization and your work. The next thing is something I am super familiar with right now because I just moved this summer. And that is the practice of letting go and making space. Letting go and making space is really about the idea that if we want new ideas and new approaches and new people and new ways of thinking to come into our organization, we need room for those things to join us. And there are a couple of ways we can do that. We can make room for those things either by letting other things go, things that have served us but no longer are needed, or by generating new space within our organization, creating new places for these new ideas, for these new people, for these new resources to come. And so I think, one of our tendencies generally is to hold on to things that exist. We are, as people, we are more comfortable with stability than change. We are fearful often of letting go of the familiar to embrace the unfamiliar. And what this does often, particularly in organizations with resource limitations, is it means that we use up a lot of our capacity, energy, and time on holding on to things that are no longer serving us. And so I, often encourage arts groups that I'm working with, not only to think about what you want to build and what you want to develop and what you want to change and what you want to grow, but also what you want to let go. Because it is not a bad thing for an organization to nurture and develop certain programs or activities and recognize that at a certain moment, a new idea, a new approach, a new program may better serve you, your organization, your community than an existing program that may have outrun its resource base or its relevance for your community. So thinking really about new ideas requires us also to think about things we're already doing and which of those things we can let go of and where we can make new space in our organizations in order to invite in the new perspectives, the new ideas, the new approaches. One of the things that often gets talked about in the for-profit sector is this word disruption. We talk about different industries and they talk about, industry disruption. In those industries in which the growth mindset is predominant, where bigger is always better, the only way for many of those industries to change, for many of those organizations to change, to get out of the cycle of sort of continual growth and development, is for a major disruption in their industry to force change, to create fundamental change in their sectors. I think that if we can, within our sector, embrace the fact that we are not about bottom line constant growth, that we are about mission delivery, that we are about the work that we do, the communities that we serve. If we can embrace that mindset and approach the way that we grow by letting go of things intentionally and without crisis or disruption, that we can make change far more efficiently, far more rapidly, and far more effectively than the sectors that have to wait for major disruption or crisis in order to change the existing structures or ways of working. So I think we've got an advantage here, but I think we have to practice and encourage ourselves to get over the fear of letting things go, to honor the things that have supported us in moving forward, but to make space for the new approaches, ideas, and programs and activities that will drive us forward. The final practice that I want to share with you is what I call sharpening the saw. And I realize I've got this very strange graphic here of these two lumberjacks here who are using this massive saw to saw the log. And this is really a metaphor. It's not about sawing logs. So I'm not sure that this is the best image. But the metaphor is this. It goes back to a kind of a story about a woodsman who goes into the woods and sees a massive tree, bigger than any tree that he's seen before. And this represents a huge and rich potential for sustaining his life and his family. And so he has great excitement about the huge tree that he has found and the opportunity. And he takes a saw and he starts to saw down this tree to take advantage of this opportunity that has come to him. And as he gets about a quarter of the way through the tree, it becomes harder and harder for him. continue and to get any further through the tree. And he keeps sawing and he keeps sawing. And another friend, another lumberjack comes up and sees him struggling. And he says to the friend, come and help me and take this on. And the friend comes and helps and tries to move it forward. And he doesn't make much progress either. And finally, the friend says to him, the problem is the saw. The saw is not sharp enough. We can't get through the tree. But the lumberjack cannot give up the notion of taking this tree down and cannot stop to sharpen the saw. And so never makes it through the entire trunk and therefore is never able to harvest this tree, this opportunity that he has found. And so I think the lesson in this and the lesson that's drawn from this story is really that we can only succeed in achieving great things, in finding new ways forward, in doing the work and the mission that we're trying to achieve, if we have the right tools in order to do that. And in this case, the right tool is the people, the leadership within the organization. You are the saw. If you do not keep your capacity strong, if you do not take care of the tool of yourself as a leader, of your team around you to do this work, then you will experience diminishing capacity and not be able to fully achieve the work that you're trying to achieve. And so it's absolutely essential as a practice to take the time and commit to supporting, nurturing, and sustaining the most important resources of your organization, which are the people who do the work, who make things happen. When our resources as people are diminished, it reduces our capacity for insight, for foresight, for creativity, and for strategic thinking. All of the things that are necessary for us to be in an emergent mindset space. If we are not looking after ourselves and nurturing ourselves as leaders and our teams as important contributors to our work, we will put ourselves in a space where we revert to a set of simple survival capacities, because we don't have the ability, when we're overworked and overextended, to move into insight, foresight, creativity, and strategic thinking. We will tend to start to focus on the immediate and lose sight of the future. When we don't have a lot of personal resources, we tend to try and do what's right in front of us, rather than thinking more long-term and planning and developing our future. And so that whole component of anticipation, of iterative change towards the future, gets lost when we don't sharpen the saw and support ourselves. When we don't look after our people, we end up engaging in the things that are urgent, and we lose sight of the things that are important. Again, our natural instinct when our resources, our capacity is limited, is to try to address the things that come at us with most urgency. And in doing that, we often lose sight of the things that are most deeply important to our work, but that don't come across our desks and into our offices in an urgent sort of sense. And even before the system fails and people entirely burn out and leave an organization, burnout takes an extreme toll on our organizations and our work if we don't invest the resources and time in really renewing and supporting those people who are critical to making this work happen successfully. So this is the second series of the mindset practices, which really speak to how we shape the future. We iterate and adapt, we anticipate, we let go and make space, and we sharpen the saw. We nurture our people, we sustain ourselves to keep the work going, to keep our capacity strong, to allow us to think and work in emergent ways. So I'm going to just sort of open up here the final 4 things that I shared with you here. The whole set of 8 that we've looked at today. Are there things in there that you think you can walk away and implement in your organizations? Are there questions that you have about the things that I've shared with you in terms of instilling this emergent mindset in your organization? Is there anything else you want to share as we finish up our time together? Cindy.
Just that last comment really resonated with me, because every arts organization has been stressed to the max, and urgent versus important, I've written that down. Hard to sometimes distinguish the difference, because when your funder says, I need this, that's fairly urgent. Anybody on here from Creative Saskatchewan? Anyway, appreciate the perspective, appreciate what our staff has been going through, and hope they can manage to continue leaping from ice flow to ice flow as they have been here. And how a board supports that, I guess we try our best. But anyway.
Thank you. And our board and community partners are so critical to this, particularly this final piece here of supporting our people. Knowing that they've got community partners behind them makes a huge difference in terms of those folks and their capacity to continue to do the work. So, I think there is a really important role, and I know that many boards are looking for the ways that they can continue to help and understand the workload and make space for folks to really think and do the important work of the organization, as well as the busy work of keeping everything running. Darcy, you had something to share.
Thanks, Anne. I do. Even though you're my coach in our other smaller breakout cohort, I like these 4 in particular. I like the anticipate and sharpen the saw analogy. As part of the nonprofit community and 9 of us industry associations, who some of my colleagues are online here, and our funder who's not Creative Sask. I do have some wisdom to use as part of the tools, but also I'm looking to anticipate point 2 that growth in the sector. And even though we're not a new sector by creative or interactive by any means, the dynamics are changing. There's a lot of youth, Indigenous, women in tech that those were never in the past. So I'm anticipating what that looks like for the future, to acknowledge your first point. And I'm excited to look forward to what other tools we can capture as we go through our Sask shifting through the cohort. Part of that too, and I probably can delve on anticipate and sharpen the saw enough, because that's exactly what we're doing right now. Part of a board, part of a community, part of the sector, the growth in the sector, and then also being acknowledged as part of our funder and their anticipation in point 2. So I'm looking forward to what that can actually be and how we can continue to build that for the sector.
Thanks, Darcy. And that brings up for me this sort of anticipation of how your sector is changing. what a wonderful opportunity for diversity of perspectives it lies ahead of you in terms of these groups that have been sort of underrepresented, who are now, you know, a focus and a growth in your sector. I think there's great opportunity ahead with that.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks. Any other thoughts, comments, questions to share? All right, I'm not seeing anybody unless Alex sees somebody that I don't. I'm going to say that we have covered the ground here this afternoon. I want to thank you all for being here to listen, to learn, to share with me. We will make the information from the slides available if that is helpful to you. There is a recording if folks from your organization have not been able to attend and you'd like to share that. Sask Arts will let you know about how to access that. And look forward to seeing many of you again in the near future. Thanks, everyone.